visible recently. I used to believe cars simply wore out, that metal gets tired, parts age, and mileage eventually wins no matter how careful you are. Act no longer feels immediate, but oil doesn't age according to appearance or optimism. It degrades chemically. Most cars fail years earlier than expected, not because of mileage alone, but because of how they're maintained over time. They do not gradually stop operating after decades of use, and they don't suddenly give up because time finally caught them. What actually happens is less immediately noticeable during normal operation. It usually happens through normal maintenance decisions that feel safe in the moment, but slowly allow wear to build until the system can no longer compensate. That's why the failure often appears sudden to the owner. From the owner's perspective, the vehicle continued operating normally, with no clear signs of a developing problem. Then a symptom finally becomes noticeable, and the estimate makes one thing clear: the failure didn't start recently, it only became visible recently. I used to believe cars simply wore out, that metal gets tired, parts age, and mileage eventually wins no matter how careful you are. It's a comforting explanation because it removes accountability. It frames mechanical failure as inevitable, even when it's the result of long-term maintenance decisions. That belief didn't survive the first engine I saw opened up after it had supposedly reached the end of its life. There was nothing sudden inside it. There was no single point of failure. The damage had developed gradually across multiple components over time. What I saw was consistent with long-term heat and lubrication stress, early wear on multiple internal surfaces, heat-related patterns across repeated cycles, and oil passages restricted enough to reduce protection where clean pressure mattered. It had been gradually degraded by years of small maintenance choices that never felt dangerous while they were being made. That was the point where I stopped listening to what people said about cars and started paying attention to what cars revealed once they were taken apart. What I saw erased every remaining excuse. Vehicles with barely 6 figures on the odometer were already internally exhausted, while others, mechanically identical, remained tight, composed, and remarkably clean well past 500,000 miles. The difference wasn't luck or manufacturing variance, it was how consistently the machine had been protected from wear that develops without producing immediate symptoms. That's when the common assumptions many drivers have stopped matching what I was seeing. Mileage doesn't end cars, accumulated neglect does. It usually appears as delayed maintenance or the assumption that a quiet engine indicates everything is functioning properly. Modern engines aren't delicate creations. They're brutally efficient systems engineered to operate reliably under continuous thermal and mechanical load, but they depend on balance, stable temperatures, clean lubrication, intact chemical protection. These aren't things owners think about because they don't announce themselves when they begin to fail. When that balance is disturbed repeatedly, even in subtle ways, wear accelerates in places the driver will never see until the wear is already permanent. Oil is usually where this gradual degradation begins, precisely because oil failure hides so well. People are taught to treat oil changes as milestones, targets to stretch as long as the engine still feels smooth. If the oil looks acceptable and the car behaves normally, the need to act no longer feels immediate. But oil doesn't age according to appearance or optimism. It degrades chemically. Fuel residue, moisture, and microscopic metal particles accumulate with every cold start and every short trip. None of that triggers a warning light. So oil that once flowed freely begins to thicken, losing its ability to protect components that rely on instant, clean pressure to survive. Timing systems, valve mechanisms, and bearings continue operating without obvious symptoms, while internal wear progresses in patterns no future oil change can correct. By the time a symptom appears, the extent of wear is already established. Early warning indicators are often absent, so the engine keeps running while wear accumulates. When symptoms finally show up, the underlying damage has usually been progressing for a long time. This same process plays out across the entire vehicle because most mechanical failures aren't sudden events. They're outcomes that develop gradually over long periods of normal operation. Take the warm-up myth, advice that sounds considerate, even careful, yet shortens engine life all the same. Letting a modern engine idle while cold doesn't protect it, it pollutes it. Fuel slips past cold piston rings, thinning oil before it can establish proper protection. Moisture
moisture settles into areas that never reach true operating temperature. At idle, the engine may take longer to reach operating temperature, which increases moisture and fuel contamination and accelerates oil degradation. Real protection begins once the engine is moving under light load, when oil temperature stabilizes and lubrication behaves as intended. But because idling damage doesn't feel immediate, it's dismissed. Transmissions meet an even more deceptive end. They're conditioned to fail without complaint. Modern marketing insists the transmission fluid lasts forever, as if friction and heat stop applying once a casing is sealed. In reality, that fluid is steadily collecting clutch material and metal dust with every mile. It becomes abrasive while still appearing clean enough to trust. Because drivers are taught to wait for symptoms, they wait, and when shifting finally changes, a hesitation, a shudder, the internal surfaces that once made smooth operation possible are already beyond recovery. Fresh fluid doesn't revive a transmission at that stage. It doesn't cause the failure. It exposes how advanced the wear already is. That's why so many people believe a fluid change killed their transmission. It didn't. The damage had been progressing quietly for years. The change simply revealed it. Cooling systems fail more slowly, but with far less forgiveness. Coolant isn't just there to prevent freezing or boiling. It carries chemical defenses that protect aluminum and prevent internal corrosion. Over time, those defenses are consumed. The coolant remains visible, the temperature gauge stays calm, but the protection is gone. Inside the engine, aluminum begins to pit, seals lose elasticity, water pumps weaken long before they leak. The early warnings are easy to rationalize: a faint smell, a gradual fluid loss, a temperature that runs just slightly higher than it used to, until one serious overheating event permanently warps the engine and turns every repair afterward into a matter of cost, not choice. Driving behavior compounds all of this, not because speed itself is evil, but because stress doesn't disappear after the moment passes. Abrupt acceleration loads components instantly. Late braking converts momentum into heat. Constant urgency forces systems to absorb punishment they were never designed to endure repeatedly. The stress doesn't disappear. It accumulates in components over time. It becomes long-term wear that settles into bushings, joints, bearings, and brakes. Calm driving doesn't feel impressive, but over hundreds of thousands of miles, it preserves alignment, controls heat, and keeps systems operating within their intended margins. These issues are easy to miss because they often develop without immediate symptoms, but long-term mileage is usually the result of consistent, uneventful maintenance decisions. By the time my car passed 300,000 miles, the pattern was no longer debatable. Failures that appeared early on other vehicles arrived much later, or not at all on mine. Not because the car was special, but because it was consistently maintained and protected from long-term damage. At 500,000 miles, people stopped asking what model it was. They started asking what had been replaced, and the answer unsettled them. Very little was replaced. No rebuilds, no major interventions, just consistent maintenance over time. At 800,000 miles, the results were clear. In most cases, failure isn't caused by mileage alone. It's the result of long-term maintenance decisions, combined with delayed symptoms that make problems look sudden. That longevity is built through restraint and attention, the kind that often seems unnecessary until compared with vehicles that failed years earlier. Most cars don't die early because they're bad machines. They die because failure patterns develop based on how the vehicle is maintained over time, one ordinary decision at a time. And once you stop changing those maintenance patterns, they simply keep going.